Good afternoon. I'm Michael Rothberg. I have the privilege of holding the 1939 Society Samuel Getz Chair in Holocaust Studies and being an affiliate of the Leve Center for Jewish Studies. And it's my pleasure on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies to welcome you to today's event, which highlights our very own professors Aomar Boum and Sarah Abrevaya Stein, and we're going to be discussing their recent edited collection, Wartime, North Africa, A Documentary History, 1934 to 1950. This event is part of the 1939 Society program in Holocaust Studies, and it's co-sponsored by various UCLA departments and centers, including the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies, the Department of History, the Center for Near Eastern Studies, the Department of Anthropology, and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. As always, I'm grateful for the hard work of the Leve Center staff, here, many of whom are here today, who make all of our events possible. And before we get started, I want to mention that 1 week from today, in this same room at 2 p.m., we're going to be hosting a lecture by Sarah Imhoff of Indiana University called Another Zionism, Jesse Samter, Queerness and Disability. And I think there are some flyers in the back for that, and we hope to see you here next week as well. Aomar and Sarah's book, I believe, is available here today, yes, I'm getting a yes, great. It's published by Stanford University Press, available through the press, of course, and wherever books are sold, but you can find it here along with Aomar Boum's newly released graphic narrative Undesirables, which also focuses on North African wartime history. So look for those. We'd like to ask you to please silence your phones at this time. Well, let me begin then by introducing Aomar and Sarah. Aomar Boum is Maurice Amato Chair in Sephardic Studies here at UCLA. He's the author of Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco, as well as that brand new graphic narrative I just mentioned, Undesirables, A Holocaust Journey to North Africa, which he created together with the artist Najib Berber. Last November, he was honored for his contributions to Jewish-Muslim understanding by the Sephardic Em Habanim Synagogue here in Los Angeles, and there are many other things we could say about Aomar, of course. Sarah Abrevaya Stein is Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies. She's also the Viterbi Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies here. She's the author and editor of 10 books, including, of course, the one that we're talking about today, which was published by Stanford with the cooperation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in just last year. And she's also the author of Family Papers, A Sephardic Journey Through the 20th Century, which was a National Jewish Book Prize finalist. Together, Aomar and Sarah previously edited the related essay collection, The Holocaust and North Africa, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that one as well today. But let us now turn to Wartime North Africa. And I can say this is really an extraordinary book. It offers the first ever collection of primary documents on North African history and the Holocaust. And as we're going to, I think, experience today, or discuss today, it gives voice to an incredible diversity of individuals and groups who are involved in the events: Muslims, Christians, Jews, women, men, children, different ethnicities, races, etc. It also draws on a multilingual archive with sources from about 10 different languages, by my count at least. And although some of the selections are drawn from published books, including memoirs, diaries, and collections of poetry, most of the selections in Wartime North Africa have never been published before or previously translated into English. So it's really not only a remarkable achievement, but really a remarkable opportunity for all of us to learn this history in a new way and to think about this history in a new way. So I'm really grateful, actually, to both of you for having done this work and along with your collaborators. So let's now let's get started. And let me ask you, first of all, you've done this essay collection before together on the Holocaust in North Africa. What made you do a documentary history as a follow-up? How did you come to this particular genre?
Dr. Boum.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for this, for your introduction, your generous introduction. I think before we start, I would like to make sure that we acknowledge our graduate students. I would start by Rebecca Glassberg, Rachel Smith, Ben Ratskov, Amber Sackett, Jesse Stuhlman. I think without their work, without their help, without their support, Chris Silver, without their support, this book would not have seen the light. So this is a project not only that Sarah and I have been involved in, but also it's a project that our students were part of and they're part of. So the idea of this book, actually, it was thought of during a class that Sarah was teaching about 4 or 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's and then I was invited to give a talk about my book, Memories of Absence, and Sarah is always thinking about different things at the same time, 16 or 17 things at once. And then she came up with this, she said, well, it would be great to have a book that puts together a lot of sources and introduces readers of Holocaust studies in World War II to what happened in the southern part of the Mediterranean. And that was it. So that's where the idea came from. And the idea, I think, it really builds on the first book that we worked on, was part of a conference in 2015 on the Holocaust in North Africa. And the idea of this book is really to complement the theoretical essays that you contributed to, Michael and other colleagues from UCLA, other colleagues from Europe. So that's where the idea came from.
And how do you expect the book to be used, or how do you envision it being used?
Well, hi everyone, and hi students in History 5. Are there some folks from my class here? Raise your hand. Yay, good to see you. Thanks for coming. So I would say, in addition to what Aomar said just a moment ago, we're so fortunate to teach at a public institution where teaching and service are part of our mandates as professors and as scholars, as well as research. And this seems to me to represent a project that brings together the ambitions of a great public institution, which is to bring knowledge to the public and create vehicles for learning. And I think it's our hope that the book has a few audiences, student audiences, so it can be used in the classroom in classes on Holocaust history, Second World War history, on North Africa, maybe on violence and conflict. On the other hand, I think for scholars of Holocaust history and scholars of the war who don't have the languages, don't have the background in North Africa, in understanding the complex role of this region in the war, and for the people who live there and experiencing the war, it can also be a vehicle, even for experts in the field. This remains a largely or little understood area. And then finally, I think a lot of these sources are just on a human scale. They're just gripping. And one can sit down, if you have a mind for history, one can really just sit down and absorb them and absorb the variety of poignant experiences that constituted the war in this region and at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they're absolutely compelling, so many compelling entries in the book. And as you say, it's also, even for someone like me who has been working for a long time in this field, and even with some interest in this region, it's still a revelation to see the many kinds of connections that cut across these different geographical locations and such. Come back to that later, I think. I'm thinking approach this working together from different disciplinary locations as an anthropologist, in Omar's case as a historian, in your case, Sarah. Of course, we're all work in interdisciplinary ways, but what's it like to collaborate, across those disciplinary locations, and how does that manifest itself in this book, would you say?
I think it was pretty smooth and easy to do that, mostly because the stories that were chosen are stories that are ethnographically talk about human experience on both sides, I think, of either in Europe or in North Africa or North and West Africa. And I think the detail, that human detail that about how each person went through the war, whether you're talking about men or women or children, those, I think, from an oral history perspective, as well as from an archival perspective, was easy to put together. And then when you look at the book itself, it does start in the year 1934, and then it ends in 1950. But the way the stories are put together, it's like really a narrative that you can tell that it takes you from one year to another, from one stage to another, and they're all human experiences that fill these gaps, these years, these events across the period of the interwar period, as well as during the war and the post-war.
Do you want to add anything from the historian's perspective?
Well, I think we can, while so many of us work interdisciplinarily, we can also sort of fetishize the boundaries of disciplines. And Omar, you're a historical anthropologist, and I'm a historian who thinks so much about lived experience, and somehow the bleeding together of those arenas was actually pretty easy. And we have both a blessing and a curse that when one of us gets an idea, they have to pester the other one until it happens. So we have a very good creative process, and I think that helped us expand the book as it developed organically to include all kinds of pressing concepts that we at first hadn't thought about including, but it continued to grow and morph because we thought well together in that respect.
Interesting. So, Omar, a moment ago you mentioned the years 1934 and 1950 that frame the book. So I wonder if you could say why those years. Again, as a scholar of the Holocaust, they're not the most obvious years to me. I would say 33 to 45, or if you're going to go into the post-war period, you might have other markers. So I'm curious about the years, and also I think it's worth maybe saying a few words about the historical context that this book, is here to is telling us about, because it's very complicated. In fact, again, even as someone who knows something about the events in the region, it's still a very multi-layered site for exploration. So if you could say a little bit about that context, and then also about this kind of periodization of 34 to 50 that you've chosen.
So I would say that the year is random, but at the same time it highlights a moment of awareness, of individual awareness about what's happening in Europe, and I'll explain that. So first of all, yes, this is a book that covers almost, I would say, 5 to 7 countries, from Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and then Senegal, and part of Mali, I would say. So it's a very wide geographic area with very large population, diverse population, ethnically, socially, economically. So, but also urban and rural. As far as the year, it begins with a document that highlights basically an awareness that Hitler is in power, and it's in a city that's within Morocco called Meknes, the city of Meknes, and it's also an awareness that comes from a Moroccan with a European background as well as a Turkish background. So there is also this. The text highlights this idea that you are sitting in a city on the western part of the North Africa, and at the same time you're conscious that something sinister is about to happen. So we are highlighting that, and then once you get to the next few stories, you start seeing not only an awareness that something is about to happen, but also the dramatization of the plot becomes really higher. And to highlight that this is a population that's aware and conscious of what's happening in Europe, and that is constantly engaged with the events that are happening in Europe. So that's the reason why that year was set up there. So we're talking, it's not in a village, it's in a very metropolitan city that is a settler city where Meknes is a city in Morocco where you have one of the largest French settlers community there. It's economically, it's relied on an economy that's very French economy that's related also to agriculture. So all of these elements, I think, for us, it's a way to set up the scene for the event to connect them to what's happening in Europe.
As you get stick with the question of context for a moment. I mean, is it possible even to lay out, like what is the wartime experience in North Africa across these different, as you say, national contexts? You've got different colonial projects going on. You've got different forms of fascism that play a role here. Is there a way to can you help us make sense of this space?
I'll take a first stab, but it's so complex that the story will have to come in layers. Wartime North Africa is a place and a time where we have the presence of multiple fascist powers. The Italians, fascist Italy is in control of Libya. There's a Spanish presence in northern Morocco. Once Germany falls once France falls to Germany, there is a collaborationist regime based out of the city of Vichy that controls southern France and France's colonies in North Africa. So we have a colonial presence in French North Africa morphs into a fascist presence in those regions as well as in West Africa. And the Third Reich, the Nazis occupy Tunisia directly for a series of months. So we already have a very complicated political landscape here of pre-existing a variety of states with citizenry with different kinds of rights and cultural makeup and different Jewish populations, then overlaid by the mixing of different forms of fascism and histories of colonialism. On top of that, you also have a really fluid local population. It's majority Muslim, but there is a strong Jewish presence, especially in particular locations and cities. There are a lot of refugees, Christian, Jewish from Europe. Some of them fled because they feared persecution because they were Jewish. Some fled because they feared persecution because they opposed the ascendant Nazi regime. And as the war begins to unfold, this becomes even more complex as the Vichy regime will deport people it considers undesirable from Europe to North Africa in order to put them in internment camps. And this is already a complicated category of people, including folks who had volunteered to serve in the French Foreign Legion in the fight against Nazism, people who volunteered for the Spanish Civil War to fight against Franco, political objectors, and more. So, and then there's another layer that we are trying to explore in the book, and with this layer I'll stop, but there's even more, and that is to say there is a population of Black West African boys and men, young men and men, who are forced into service by the French military following a long tradition whereby the French government forced male colonial subjects into service for the French army. This dates back to the 19th century. And some of those forced conscripts are serving in North Africa. Sometimes they're serving as overseers in camps, but they themselves are a kind of prisoner themselves. So this space of wartime North Africa represents the intersection of all of these populations, and sometimes they are meeting in actual individual spaces, such as camps. Did I leave some out?
No.
Okay.
As you see, there's a lot going on. No, it's incredibly complex. I mean, it's really complex, but that was a very helpful overview, I think. I mean, are there any of the, can you maybe mention a source or two that you feel kind of starts to get at some of what's going on in that complexity?
Which
Do you
one
want
do
to
you-
start? Do you want to read Al-Ghadari?
Yeah. Let me read one by a Muslim who grew up in the period of the war. It's page 75.
Omar, before you begin, would you hold the microphone?
Yeah. So let me read an interview we did with a Muslim by the name of Hussein al-Ghadari, who talks about the period of the war in a village in southern Morocco. And it's called Famine in the Atlas Mountains, in the anti-Atlas Mountains, around 1940s, early 1940s. The year of hunger, otherwise known as the year of rations, killed so many people and destroyed so many communities in our region. A combination of war, typhus, drought, and famine was like a wildfire that struck the southern hinterland. Palm trees did not yield that many dates, and the few that did grow were confiscated by tribal lords and distributed between the Pasha of Marrakesh al-Glawi and the French colonial administrators. News circulated that Hitler stole the food of France to feed the German population, forcing France to take native North Africa's food shares. Each family was given a ration of food, including just a few grams of wheat and a small portion of sugar and cooking oil. Not all families were benefactors even of this. Rural areas like ours were not even on the list for distribution. Families trekked the mountains of Bani looking for hedgehogs, lizards, other lizards and wild desert animals. I remember people were so hungry that they had to eat their own donkeys and their source of farming. We wouldn't follow Islamic rules anymore, and many were forced to eat dogs and cats to survive. As the food shortage grew, people started looking for edible grass, especially as the slow supply of American wheat did little to stop hunger. As if that were not enough, typhus struck communities, killing hundreds of families. Clothes were rare, people walked barefoot. Stories circulated that people waited for families to bury their dead and then dug up their tombs to take out the shrouds and use them to cover themselves. Others turned burlap barley bags into garments. The mining companies continued to enlist hungry and weak workers from the village in its mines in the Anti-Atlas. Many local villagers were forced to work in the cobalt mine of Bouazer, which was located a few miles from Fumsgid. Others were enlisted to clear roads between Ouarzazate and Marrakesh. So that's one story from a Muslim, and it was told in Darija, in Moroccan Arabic.
Well, obviously, you get a lot of insight into the difficulties of everyday life during the war in this particular region, which is not where one usually thinks of World War II extending to, I think. And so you get a lot from that. One of the things that struck me, and I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about it, was this idea, he reports these kind of rumors that, news circulated that Hitler stole the land of France to feed the German population, forcing France to take native North Africa's food share. So this interesting linking of Europe and North Africa. I'm kind of curious, is there a historical basis for this? Is this more a kind of vernacular way of understanding what's happening? I mean, it's fascinating either way, but I'm just kind of curious if this is more than a rumor, if this is actually kind of substantiable.
I think some of these rumors were substantiable. I think the reason why Because when you look at, this is a mine, for instance, that was highly connected to the German industrial. The mine of Bouazer, and I actually checked this a couple of times with Hussein al-Ghiddari, and the Germans are already involved in this mine through their consulate in Casablanca, as early as 1940, late 1940. So there is that. If he was talking about a different mine, I think that would be, I would raise that as probably potentially a rumor. But this is actually definitely established as a historical fact. Yeah.
So there are material links connecting. Yeah. Interesting. You mentioned also just now after reading it, this was an interview that was done, I think specifically for the book.
No. We it was part of the. So what we did is that we have each one of us, Sarah and I, we had our own collection of stories, our archives, and then we tried to link or to see what kind of stories we have that potentially can be used for the book. So, and sometimes, we did find this story that really connects, because it's connected to the mine of Bouazer, one of the labor camps. And sometimes when a story is not clear, we go back and then we asked some people who helped me collect interviews to do a follow-up. So it was primarily an interview that I did myself, and the follow-up was done by one of my colleagues in Morocco.
And actually, I want to just say something interesting about that individual. So Omar himself conducted the initial interview that we're citing from with this man, who's still alive.
Yeah.
And this is really your story to tell, but you were able to return to visit him again with the book.
Yeah.
Will you talk about that for a second?
So one of the joys actually of doing this project is seeing how it impacts people themselves once they see the fruit. So when the book was published, he's been asking me for a copy. So I did take a copy, and actually we had a photo. I took a photo of him with the book, and the book now is being circulated across the village. So, and it's actually, he put it in a bag because he thought that people are touching it and then they're making it dirty, and so it's really, and then even though he doesn't speak English, just seeing the images, what's really fascinating about the pictures, there is a picture of him, and also seeing the images of the war people are looking at that, and I think the book itself has its own story as far as the history and how the history is being told.
That's fascinating. So, and the other thing that I wanted to ask though about that, or another theme I wanted to put on the table related to this was, so as you mentioned, it was an interview conducted in Darija, right, Moroccan Arabic, and that's, of course, as I mentioned already in my introduction, one of 10 or more languages that you are drawing on here. There are some English originally English language documents, but most of the things, of course, are translated. So tell us a little bit about that process and the project of translation, because that's one of the most valuable things here, I think, is that this collects documents across languages that few, if anybody, could master as an individual. So it's a collective project. So maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, happy to. Well, in this respect, the book really is born of our collaboration with students. Rebecca Glassberg, sitting here, was our lead partner as an editor and a head translator and an active translator herself. We had a team of translators. I think between the two of us, we could read all the languages. Is that true? Except
Hebrew for me.
Well, yeah. So we tried to check all translations, either ourselves or with the help, so that no translation was the work of a single set of hands. But translating historical documents from this era and time is not just a matter of, as you know, of knowing the language, of knowing the words. There's all sorts of complex questions that had to be teased out. How do you render the spirit of the person, including people writing in a language that is not their native language, in a state of desperation, with desperate pleas for assistance to a philanthropy? How do you render the spirit of that, of the original language fairly, and justly, and clearly in English? One of the more astonishing translations, I think, Rebecca, I'm not sure if you would agree, is a translation that Rebecca Glassberg did with Jesse Stuhlman of an amazing pamphlet known as Les Risques that was written very early. It's one of the first sources. It's written in, I think, 39, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, written in 39. And this man was a poet and a playwright, and he wrote this September-October of 1939, just after Germany occupies Poland. He writes a pamphlet, and I'm going to read a little bit of it, and it's so lacerating that he becomes terrified. And he distributes it in his town, and then he goes about trying to capture every copy and burn it, because he understands it to be so inflammatory. But just let me read you two little sections that I think hint at the complexity of the Translation Act that was required by these sources. I'm going to skip around a little bit, but I'm just going to read you two sections of this rather long poem, and it begins, for context, to the reader. I have seen hatred flourish in the country of the Nazis, and a whole nation endure the caustic, corrosive acid thrown at them like a cruel joke by the speeches of an insane, vulgar buffoon. This pernicious clown, seized by fury, preaching denunciation, murder, and violence. Despite my indifference, I felt my face flush and turn bright red from shame and disgust. In my feeble hands, the whip of satire is too clumsy to excoriate Hitler. At least it expresses my complete aversion, and that is why, reader, though I may displease you, in order to release my sorrow and to cry out my anger, I offer you this text filled with indignation. And just to read now, to skip a little bit and to read one section to show you, I guess, how complex some of these translations were. This is a bit of the poem that parodies the SA, that is the paramilitary Nazi organization. So what follows is a complicated, well, now it's a translation, a complicated play on these letters, SA. So his rendering is like this through the translation of Jesse Stuhlman and Rebecca Glassberg, both very accomplished graduate students at UCLA. So I'm reading now. Oh, abject scoundrels, abominable slobs, accomplished sleazebags and aggressive smooth-talkers, acrid sycophants, servile assailants, swordsmen attracted to innumerable crimes, sordid assassins and asinine slaughterers, starved slayers, sanguinary asses, sinister antics, scatological airheads, you who feed your sanguine appetites with blood, savage administrators and sectarians of atrocity, sterile abortuses, supreme absconders, remember that one day the crowd will put an end to your ferocious misdeeds by way of your execution. That was a tough one, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say one of the hardest things about that one was that in French, it's written with, SA, so then the adjective comes afterwards.
Right.
Yeah.
So then we have a lot of the AS, but
Right.
I think hearing it, I feel like it gives the
I thought that was very effective. I mean, it was instantly clear what you were doing,
Yes.
so I thought it was impressive. But I'm curious what airheads is the translation.
I don't remember it this time.
several surprises in a lot of the things.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so can I add something to the translation process?
Please.
I think one of the other really interesting things about this whole process is how we got a lot of help from members of the community itself. So we had to reach out to members of the Jewish community and Muslim communities in the United States, in Israel, in France, in Morocco, in Tunisia. So we got a lot. So this is also another layer as far as even the translation. So sometimes there are words that we don't understand in Judeo-Arabic, for instance. Then you reach out to somebody in Israel to get the help, or just in the valley, just around here. So that's, I think, that was also another part of the translation.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Let me ask a couple more questions, and then maybe we can also open it up to discussion with the audience. For me, I have to say, one of the revelations of this book and the work that you've been doing to both individually together in recent years is about the extent of the camp system in North Africa, labor camps, internment camps, penal camps, all of this sort of stuff, which I think, again, when we think of the Holocaust and we think of the Second World War, we do think of camps, but we don't think of these camps, or we haven't yet thought of these camps particularly. So could you tell us a little bit about this network of camps across North Africa? You've alluded to them a little bit today, but tell us a bit more. What was their function? Who was there? Who were the guards? Why were they there in this place?
Okay.
I think it's a very important aspect of the story.
Thank you. Well, the first thing that one has to say is that there were no death camps in North or West Africa. There were instead a network of camps introduced and overseen by the French, by the Italians, by the Germans. Many of them were repurposed camps that existed already for some reason or another. Some, especially in Tunisia, were near northern cities, and the inmates who would be lodged there were compelled to do forced labor on municipal projects. Many were in the south, on mines, or along the route of a railroad that France had begun to construct during the colonial era to cross the Sahara, to ferry bodies and people from sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa across the Sahara to the Mediterranean, whence they would be exported to Europe, to people to fight in battles or minerals or what have you. These were also labor camps. There were also detention and penal camps scattered throughout the region. They each have their different function, and they each have their different makeup. Jews were mostly sent to forced labor camps in the north, in general. The southern camps tended to be camps where a mixed prisoner population would mingle. That population would include former volunteers for the Spanish Civil War, former volunteers for the French Foreign Legion, Muslim anti-colonialists who were perceived political enemies of the regime, as well as European refugees who were labeled so-called undesirables by the French. The case in Libya is different. In Libya, we have camps created by the Italian fascist regime that deported en masse Jews from Jewish Libyan Jews who didn't hold foreign passports, deported to camps where some of them would be for a short time, some would be for a longer time, and from there, some of them were deported to camps in Italy, and from there, some would end up in the German death camps. I want to say something else, although it isn't really directly addressing your question, Michael, which is that there are other North African Jews and some Muslims who end up in the Nazi death camps in Europe, and some who are annihilated there. A few are deported directly from North Africa, counter to what the general rule was. Others, and the majority, would be living in especially France, but living in Europe, but mostly in France, in Marseille and in Paris and other places. And they were immigrants from North Africa or the children of immigrants from North Africa who were born in France, who would be swept up in the deportation machine and would, many of whom died in the death camps, the German Nazi death camps in the East. So I've really only begun to lay out these dynamics, but there are, as I say, just such a complex mix of different populations, different forms of forced labor, different locations, and also different overseers, including French, including European officials, including forcibly inducted West African officials, including forcibly inducted Moroccans. Who have I left out? Because there's surely more.
I think that's
And,
it.
and some of these camps held women and children and families, as well as just male prisoners alone.
And the guards included, again, conscripted
The guards
soldiers
included, so if we speak of the French camps, for example, the guards included officials representing France from France, and they also included indigenous soldiers from West Africa or from North Africa who are forcibly conscripted.
For me, one of the most incredible sources that you have included here is this excerpts from this memoir by Gabriel Benichou, who was an Algerian Jew who left Algeria as a teenager after being excluded from school and went to live with his sister in Marseille. And then he and his sister were arrested and deported first to Drancy, which was the main sort of transit camp for French Jews, and then from there to Auschwitz. And he survived, but not, in order to write his memoirs, but not before being then taken by the Nazis to help clear up the Warsaw Ghetto after its destruction. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible story, absolutely an incredible story. And then we get a description of being in Drancy, which was fascinating. And meeting other North Africans there, which I thought was also really interesting. So it's an unusual story, but it's not completely unique, clearly. And then also of his return to Algeria after the war, carrying a rucksack with an eagle and a swastika on it, and which held all of his possessions, and then kind of confronting. People who, for good reason, just had no idea what had happened to him. Could not comprehend his experience in the camps and didn't even have a category to put him in, right? He's a political prisoner, but he wasn't in the army, so how could he be a political prisoner? And who is he really and what's going on? I thought that was just incredibly fascinating. And it raises also a kind of larger question. I think it's clear, at least it's clear to me, that for those of us in North America and in Europe, this is really, it's a new story to most of us who haven't been doing this kind of the work that you've been doing. I'm wondering what the status of knowledge and memory is in North Africa itself. In other words, would these stories also be new to most people in North Africa? Or are these things that have been transmitted either informally across generations or, I don't know, in school books or official histories? Like, what is the status of this history in North Africa itself?
I think for me personally, and I think this is something I share with Sarah too, is the idea of writing these histories from an official perspective by focusing on the bureaucrats, by focusing on these individuals at the top, is really something that I think has dominated at least some of the North African historiography or history. So for us, is one of the contributions is to really fill this gap by focusing on the stories of individuals, regular people. And I think by focusing on the individuals and these regular stories, you really describe the complexity of suffering and challenges that faced families, that faced individuals, men, women, elderly and young people. Once you bring in that these personal narratives, I think you open up a new field of research that has always been seen as not important in some of these historiographies. That's hopefully that's the contribution, because when I look at textbooks, history textbooks, or we call ijtimaiyat generally in some of these North African countries, you see these stories in the headlines, big. So I think we want to make sure that these stories, through oral history or through going back to the archives, digging what has been marginalized and silenced, and writing it down, and then putting it in these big, large narratives. That's what we hope, as far as the creating new conversations or launching new conversations within these schools of thoughts.
The Benichou source that you were referring to is the last source in our book, and in fact we pin that concluding date 1950 on him because we find it such a haunting source. It's not that it's the last source one could find. We just found it so powerful we wanted to end with him. You described his story up until his return to his native town of Tlemcen, but there's more, which is that he is suffering with what we would understand as post-traumatic stress syndrome, which of course he doesn't understand as post-traumatic stress syndrome, nor does anyone around him. He suffers from an inability to eat, bad dreams, he has insomnia, he's emaciated, he's malnourished, he has anxiety, and we end with him, I think, partly because it is a sense of unresolved trauma that extends into the post-war era and up to the present. That is to say, non-memorialized, not historicized, not taught, not documented, no systematic attempt to conduct interviews of this population, left out of the vast majority of syllabi on the war or the Holocaust, left out of the majority of syllabi on North African history. So I think Ben Ishu's trauma, to some extent, I mean, we hope to fill the gap, but remains a trauma of history as well, that I think it is our hope that we are beginning to join others in encouraging a redressing of.
Yeah, it was really striking to me that excerpt that you just described, that you end with, in some ways it's so familiar. It sounds so much like some of the narratives you find in Charlotte Delbo and her stories of the return of French political prisoners and also some Jewish prisoners, to France after the war, and you get that same sense of trauma and these difficult returns and this sort of thing. And at the same time, it has this specificity of this unusual experience across the Mediterranean and back, which just adds another dimension that you don't necessarily find in so many of those other familiar stories. So it's really fascinating. I mean, I take the point, and I think you're right, that, the richness of the book is the richness of a kind of history from below, I guess, of a kind of grassroots memory and history, and a history of everyday life, a history of ordinary people, for the most part. The Leopold Senghor and others are also here, too, so there are some, significant public figures as well. Mimi, right, yeah. So there's some well-known figures, but a lot of it is more regular people, I think, as you said, Omar. But I want to take it back up, and maybe in my concluding question or two, from that micro level to ask about the implications of these sources for thinking about the Second World War and about the Holocaust. And I'm also, I'm struck because in the last couple of years, especially though this goes back further, I've been involved in lots of debates about, for example, the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism. Mm-hmm. And in some places, this is very controversial to talk about these sorts of connections, in Germany, for example. But I'm curious what kind of light this collection sheds on bigger questions like that, on controversial questions like that of the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism or other forms of political violence. How does this change our sense of the war? How does this change our sense of the Holocaust? And do you see this as part of a new turn in Holocaust studies in particular, which I kind of do. Yeah. And I could give other examples, but I think I'm curious to hear what you guys think.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think we should all write about it together, because it actually does. It's a question and a complex set of questions that exist at the intersection of our work. But the debate, such as it is a debate about colonialism and Nazism, or colonialism and the Holocaust, in some ways what has inflamed that debate is the sense by some critics of the approach to implicate these stories. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The approach by the critics assume that it represents some kind of historical or theoretical or even ethical leap. And here in this book, we show there is no leap. There's not even a step. It's completely intertwined. Yeah. It is a single story, and they are each unfolding in dialogue and response to one another. So, in a way, I think that is a useful retort to a tired conversation. You know, that you've been trying to argue against such criticism for so long, but the response is tired. Your approach is not tired, but the response is tired.
Understood.
And I think it presents us with a new avenue to reveal that in a new fashion.
I want to add something related to the camps, for instance. The idea when you think about the Holocaust, and the moment you mention the Holocaust, for at least in some North African circles, the idea, well, it has nothing to do with Europe, because the first thing people think is death camp. It's about the extermination of European Jewry, and I think we can say that the Holocaust and North Africa, but in a different way. It's a more nuanced way, because there are camps that existed, but they were camps for different purposes. They are different from the European camps, but they're also connected, as Sarah mentioned, they're intertwined. I think, and that movement, circulation of people, when you think about the war, you have to think about expanding and the geographic terrain to figure out how all of these issues worked out. And I think one way to do that, I think the personal stories really help do that. And you have what's happening in Ukraine. It's one example, for instance. You can't think about it just in these geographic areas and what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, but it goes beyond that. It has ramifications beyond Europe, on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think that's why the story, these personal stories really clarifies that in a better way.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. So let's open things up and ask if there are questions from the audience. We have some time. Yes.
It seems to me that you have been dealing with bringing out such new information. As Michael says, this is his field, and this is new, somewhat new to him. It seems to me there's such a sin of unacknowledged suffering in this geographic area. When I think of universities teaching Holocaust courses, first of all, when I went to Berkeley in the 1960s, there wasn't even a course on the Holocaust. Anything. Nobody read books about it. There were no novels read. There was nothing. So, but this is another unacknowledged Holocaust period that we were completely blind to. And I find that so difficult to comprehend. I don't understand how this happened.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Do you want to answer?
Go ahead.
Well, I think that there have been, I agree, in a way it is just difficult to fathom, given how much has been written, how many films have been made. On the other hand, I think that what we've seen really since the end of the war, since the end of since the liberation of the camps, is that with each sort of successive scholarly generation, there is a rethinking of of what the story means. Who are the actors? What is its geography? What is its source base? What are its implications? What are its legacies? And while more and more and more has been written, those questions keep being asked and answered in different ways. And I think that there was a moment of thinking about new regions. There was a moment of thinking about women, a moment of thinking about children. So the moment of kind of leaving the story of Germany and going to the east, going to the Sephardic lands for the first time of Southeastern Europe. So I think this, in some ways, actually participates in an ongoing expansion and evolution of the boundaries of Holocaust history, geographic and conceptual. So it's shocking, but with each of these expansions, it's been shocking anew that there is so much that we don't know. And I hope it's the beauty of teaching and training graduate students that we will, in turn, be shocked and maybe even shamed by what we don't know now. But that's for the future.
No, I think there were works that were done about this period by different scholars from writing in different languages. But most of the work, I think most of the archive, at least to some extent, had to be done in French. So, and you know what, the French school of historiographical school of looking at the Holocaust, I think even the French state and the French government had to come at a late moment, until the late 1990s, to that moment of reckoning about how to deal with this period, how to interpret this period. So it's a question of priorities, I think. And the idea of how, even in Israel, for instance, when you look at some of the scholars who looked at this question, one of the first books, I think, really, I would say, the Holocaust in World War II and North Africa was late 1970s, early 80s. So I see it really as a moment of what priorities different schools of history and historiography had at the moment. In the post-independence period in North Africa, the priority is nationalism, Arab-Islamic identity. Mm-hmm. And then you come and talk about these other things later on. And there is a Holocaust moment now, I think, in North Africa, in Morocco. And that's tied to national stories and national historiographies. So that's the way, I think, in relation to what Sarah mentioned, is what is important at what moment. And how do you put more light on the topic? That's what we hope this project and this work will do.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you for the book. It sounds like a tremendous contribution. And then if you'll indulge me, I've got two questions. The first is, if I'm understanding correctly, there are people taken from camps in North Africa, taken to Italy, taken to other places, and eventually some of them wind up in some of the German camps. And I'm wondering how they decided who were the people that they were going to take all the way back and who were going to be, how they decided who was going where. And then I'm assuming, and I could be wrong, that there were North African Jewish communities, and there were communities of European Jewish refugees in North Africa. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what the relationships were, either during the war or prior to the war, what the relationships were between those communities. Did they see themselves as one large family, or were there kind of ethnic, national distinctions that kept each other arm's length? I'm just wondering what that relationship was.
Mm-hmm. Shall I take the first and you can take the second? Yeah. Just in relation to the first part of your question, that is unique to Italy and to Libya. That is not true of other camps. So the Italians at a certain point in the war have expelled Libyan Jews to camps, and then the tide of war shifts, and they deport those Jews again to camps in Italy, and then the tide of war shifts again, and that part of Italy falls under German control. And when it falls under German control, mostly those Jews are sent to Bergen-Belsen. They're actually not sent to the east, to the death camps in the east. And some will survive and return home. So that does not happen anywhere else, right?
Yeah. That's a great question. Your second, I think there was a community in Morocco. There were about 250,000 Jews. Libya, close to 60,000. Algeria, between 120 to 140,000. And Tunisia, around 80 to 100,000 Jews. So this is an indigenous community in all over the region. And of course, yes, you have all these refugees coming. The first thing many of them ended up doing is going to Jewish neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Now, we do know some stories, including stories we collected here, some Moroccan Jews who live in the valley who were connected to the American army after Operation Torch. But I would love to see dissertations and research about that relationship mm-hmm. between European Jews and the local Jewish communities. There is somebody that I know of, someone who's working on this, but I think we need more dissertations mm-hmm. on this topic.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm sorry, I apologize if I missed this, but earlier we heard from Aomar about why the documentary history of wartime North Africa began where it began in 1933, which is earlier than when most of us think the Holocaust period began. What I would like to know is why did it end why did it end where it ended in 1950, as opposed to the Michael mess in 1945. I know this is a spoiler, and you might not know how to answer it if you want to. Look, but I just want to at least a hint why it ended.
Yeah.
Good question.
Great.
Yeah,
Or
thank
not
you.
even later than 1950.
Well, so, I mean, Omar sort of addressed the concepts behind this earlier, but just to emphasize again, we wanted the chronological framing to be, to emerge organically from the North African context, rather than choosing pivotal dates in Europe that have classically been the benchmarks of the timeline of the war. We wanted it to emerge from the voices from North Africa. So the first one is a source that is written in 1934 in Morocco that likens Hitler to Haman, the villain of the Purim, the telling of the Purim story. The last source is the one that Michael encouraged us to talk about earlier, by the man who was Algerian born, goes to France, goes to Auschwitz, survives and comes back to his hometown of Tlemcen, and is meant to signal this ongoing legacy of trauma and the lack of information. So the bookends are two voices that, you know, aren't, it isn't the declaration of war, it isn't the end of a war, it isn't a battle. It's a very local, kind of quiet way of marking time.
Yeah.
That's a great.
I have a question. How much was known by the Jews in North Africa about what was happening in Europe, and in what kind of time period? Came across not long ago at the Hitler Haggadah,
Yeah.
which I thought was kind of strange and fascinating at the same time. I mean, using the word Hitler with Haggadah, and obviously there was a lot of knowledge, or some knowledge, and I'm just curious how much that was widespread, and what did it do? Did it change the way people behaved?
I think there was a lot of knowledge about it.
Yeah.
There was people were connected to, because most of you have an established school system called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. These are well-educated, a lot of Jews all across the region who are connected to what's happening in France, and including the text that Sarah read about Les Hitleristes. The author did some of his schoolings in Paris. Some areas they didn't know. In some parts of the south, villages, areas in the south, that I actually did some of my research, and people didn't know. Local Muslim, and until the end of the war, until the American landing. Once you start seeing this American wheat, American sugar, all kind of food coming and being trickling down to the south to help with the drought, to help with the famine, then you start people asking questions, what is this? So, but in the majority of urban communities, they knew, they were connected, they had an idea about what's going on in the war, and they were also very worried and anxious about the wartime.
But I mean, there's a question, it's a more general question too, not just about North Africa, about what actually people knew. So they knew something was going on, but what did they know? And again, I think of Delbo and one of these stories that she collects of a young Jewish woman whose mother is deported, and and then a little later she's deported, and she said toward Auschwitz, and she said, "I was the happiest day of my life. I was going to see my mother again." But she had no idea where she was going, in fact, and I think that's probably true for most people. So they had some sense, but of course not. And I was struck by that actually in the poem Les Hitleristes, that that there's this ode to Hitler, and what's interesting is it sort of addresses non-Jewish Germans, and particularly women, saying Hitler is going to kill your husbands and your children. And it was striking to me that it doesn't really single out, at least in the parts that I read, it's not about Jewish victims of Hitler so much. It's actually about the Germans themselves are being victimized by Hitler. It's not something you would write after the war, I think, in the same way. So there was knowledge, but of course, like everywhere, it was knowledge that was limited and mediated and, specific to that particular moment in time, I think.
Yeah.
And can I add something to your question that's actually Michael just reminded me of, is the idea also the difference between some texts. You have religious texts, you have the one that you mentioned, the Haggadah. It has to do with basically people are relieved, they're thanking God that they were able to survive what happened to the Jews of Europe. So there is this awareness, but this happened after the American landing, after Operation Torch. This is definitely, and that's why you see different texts. You see texts written in Judeo-Arabic, you see texts written in French, you see a lot of music. You see also, right after the American landing, you see music coming from both Muslims and Jews, talking about what happened. But that's an interpretation that happened after the fact. Now, when you look at the period even during the German occupation of Tunisia, you see also some texts that were written about by Jews about the danger that's really facing the community. Yeah.
There are questions?
Yeah.
Two questions. First, can you generalize about how indigenous Jews in North Africa fared during the war? And the second question is, you mentioned Senegal, which is not in North Africa. So I'm wondering how Senegal gets tied in. Were they just running the camps the way you mentioned, or was there more?
I will do my best. Local Jews had different experiences depending on where they lived. But they were, in general, we can say they were subject to the laws that push them out of the professions, that forbid them from certain practices, education, if it's not a particular school, that take their property, so spoliation and race laws that strip them of their nationality, if they had it before, as Algerian Jews did. Then for many indigenous Jews, boys and men were sent to forced labor. But it depends where they lived. And Jews, like Muslims, suffered from the things that were affecting Muslims and their neighbors all across the region, from shortages of food, from risk of disease, from the hazards of sexual violence for women that came with occupation of troops, both Axis and Allied. These are all themes that we try to reflect in the book. More than that, I would say that the war changes Jewish-Muslim relations for many Jews in the region. It's not that Jews all left after the war, but there is a sense, the war is one in a series of events, would you say, that creates a sense of unease and displacement, I would say. And the way in which nationhood is constructed in the wake of the war in these various places further compounds that sense of unease. In terms of West Africa, the Vichy regime, so that's the collaborationist French regime that oversees France's colonies in North and West Africa during the war. West Africa falls under the Vichy regime, so these laws also apply to West Africa, but there isn't a large community of Jews who are there. There are some Jews, but they're very few, and they tend to be people passing through. But West Africa is used as a place for camps to house other kind of wayward groups that are deemed enemies of the regime, especially
sailors. You have a lot of Danish sailors.
Right, exactly.
Belgium and
sailors,
yeah.
Right. Some British prisoners of war get put in camps there. So, but it's a different kind of camp, and it's a different camp population.
How about the parts of North Africa that came under direct German control with the Africa Corps?
You have only Tunisia, and I think the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, the last, I think, the last number, I think probably 4, they have about 40 camps, between, I would say 30 to 40 camps. They talk about the camps that were under German control. So definitely, that's the only place where you have camps.
Is it
And
much worse there?
oh yeah, no, because these are some generally under German control. So you have harsher policies and treatment compared to some of the camps that were under Vichy control, at least in the early period of the war.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Within Senegal, were these things taking place in population centers like Dakar, or were they in interior or rural regions where not very many people could see what was going on?
There was only one camp, but not far from Dakar, so outside of Dakar. Actually, the remains are still there. We have a colleague, a Senegalese scholar who's working on this topic. Yeah.
Maybe since we've been okay, maybe one more. One more. Yes.
It's actually a combo.
Sure.
First of all, you were talking about 45 to 50. When the Vichy government law fell down, did they keep the, like what happened a lot in Europe, where they kept the actual people in control, or did they all slip back? Were they all like replaced by other? Was there any retribution on that? And also the other question is more of a frivolous one, but you're taking place during obviously one of the most famous films of all time. So I have to ask whether that at all played into your head, or you just sort of said, nope, I'm not going to do it.
Right. Okay, both good questions. Operation Torch is the Anglo-American Allied invasion that in Morocco and extending into Algeria, that creates an Allied foothold in North Africa, from which the Allies will slowly make their way east and then up to Europe through Sicily. So when the Allied powers come in, this is late 43, when the Allied powers arrive, one might expect that the laws of the Vichy regime would be immediately overturned, but they weren't. What happens is that the Allies make strategic compromises with the existing French authorities. They are also working with the Free French organization, but they are nonetheless making compromises to not only keep peace on the ground, but for financial motives. And so as a result of this, many of the camps remain in place, and many of the prisoners remained imprisoned, and many of the same guards remain as their overseers. There are some factions of the prisoner population who have more international advocates, and others who have less. So the duration of time that they stay will depend. But we include a lot of heartbreaking pleas from prisoners that extend after Operation Torch, when there is no longer fascist occupation in North Africa, but those people are still in fascist camps. So that's quite extraordinary. Casablanca, the cafe, what's it called in Casablanca? Thank you. Rick's Cafe is obviously one of the most iconic spaces of Hollywood. It's kind of a fantasy. There's an element of truth, and the element of truth is that there were a lot of desperate refugees in Morocco whose stories we are representing here. What's wrong about that vision of Rick's Cafe is that those people would have been in camps. They wouldn't have been sitting in Casablanca. Any foreigner would have been arrested and deported, women and men, to French-controlled camps.
So no underground, like the letters of transit, so to speak.
Well, it's a mishmash. I mean, at some point, there were, at various points in the war, there are refugees desperate for letters of transit, but they're not whiling away their time over, aperitifs at Rick's Cafe. They are incarcerated in camps.
Okay, well, I think we'll stop there on that note. Thank you both for discussing with us. Thank you above all for editing this book, and I really urge everyone to get their own copy because it's really a fascinating collection. So thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.